Hey everybody, Todd Dammit here. Today brought to you by Lanakai Ukuleles. That's right. A guy like this plays ukuleles. Today, I had the very big pleasure of speaking to somebody. Lauren runs a podcast called True Crime and Cocktails, and a friend of ours sent a link about herself and her cousin who is from Saskatchewan, and how their favorite band was the Age of Electric. But Lauren is a massive actor. She's in an NBC sitcom called Superstore, which you can find on Hulu or Netflix, I believe, in Canada and a few other places. She has a background in Second City, which is out of Toronto or Chicago, where you saw Chris Farley and Mike Myers and all these great improv actors go on to be. So we spent a whole chunk of time talking about being Canadian in the US, her time with Second City, her time on Superstore, and her podcast, True Crime and Cocktails. So many things that I am obsessed with. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, Lauren Ash. Here.
Totally.
We're recording now, so now we
Yes.
got all that slander and shit talk out of the way. So
Of
we
course, it was inevitable.
It was inevitable, yeah. I just wanted to make sure we didn't get in trouble.
Yeah,
these
exactly.
days.
The lawyers, they're very pricey.
Oh, I know. Trust me, yeah. No, but I was just thinking to myself, because you check off so many boxes for me. It's like the Second City thing is an hour conversation. Superstore
Totally.
is an hour-long conversation. Canada is an hour-long conversation. So if you're not busy for the next 3 to 6 hours, we should be good.
Listen, I've diapered myself, so I'm ready to go.
I have not. Catheter, please. Where's my catheter? But all that stuff, it's like, I really don't even know where to start, because there's, again, and the podcast thing, the true crime stuff is like that's an hour for me. Like, honestly, like, it's like,
Right.
I was aware of your guys's podcast, but I have not heard. I should just point out really quickly, because we touched on this a bit, that the reason that I reached out, or my wife reached out, was because you guys on True Crime and Cocktails, your podcast, had mentioned the Age of Electric, the band I was in, and I still kind of currently am a part of, from back in the day, because you're from Belleville, Ontario.
Yes.
And your cousin Christy is from, where is Christy from exactly?
Well, she moved around a lot, but she currently is in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan.
And Hell yeah, she is.
Yes, she's been in Yorkton, Regina, Moose Jaw, so she's a real kind of Saskatchewan gal. So.
Well, she's full on Saskatchewan. Full
on.
I grew up in, I was born in Estevan, Saskatchewan.
Yes.
Then we moved up to northern Manitoba for 12, 13 years, a town called Lynn Lake. And we moved back to Lanigan, Saskatchewan, east of Saskatoon. So really Saskatchewan. So I graduated there, and then, then moved on from there. But
Right.
It's so funny to hear, like, because we got Yorkton TV in Lanigan, CICC, CKOS.
That's amazing. I love that.
So when I I don't think I really connected that Christy was in Saskatchewan. I assumed she was, from Canada, but was in LA with you or whatever. So
no, and it really has been kind of just a product of the pandemic. Like we're very close, and we've been having these kinds of like Zoom conversations. And I was like, I think we should just start recording these and putting them out there, because why not? And everybody's doing it, and why shouldn't we? And it's been such a joy. It's such a like silver lining, because I don't know that we would have thought of the idea had we not been in this Zoom world. But it's been so much fun. And yeah, she's up there in Moose Jaw, and she's become like a local Moose Jaw celebrity.
Hell yeah, she has. I can only imagine. I play in a side project. Well, it's actually a very full-on band. We call it Took. It's all Canadian guys that live in the US, and we cover like Chilliwack and like April Wine and Loverboy and all these things. But the guitar player's from Moose Jaw. The Churko family, he was in a family band from Moose Jaw, so she might be aware of that. It's really cool to hear that. But again, it's around your guys' love for true crime, I assume, is what sort of spawned this. Because there was on the thing you talked about was part of her her ability to research was the fact that she had sussed out like the Dahl family in Regina, Saskatchewan, or something. Like the Dahl family, the Dahl brothers in the other half of the Age of Electric come from Regina. So she had called some Dahl family and
well, yeah. And what I love is that as you're walking through like your history, you're saying this as though I don't already know, because I am like the biggest fan and I'm trying very hard to play it cool. But yes, so we were like legitimately the biggest Age of Electric fans. And so in high school, she was like, I found this phone number. I found this phone number for a K Dahl. Like, do you think it's Kurt? And I was like, I don't know. So clearly we had to three-way call, like me silently. Also, like, why me on the line? I don't know. And the biggest question I have is like, what would you have done if it was him? Like, what if he had picked up and like, yes, like what would that have been? Just giggle fit and hang up? Like, I don't know. But that really was the beginning of her research skills. Yeah.
Wow.
Honestly.
The best part of all of this is if you had actually reached his family, his mother Carol, who is still an angel, would have had you over for coffee. She would have had, lunch, or you guys would have been long-term friends at this point. I mean, you probably should call her now, really, frankly. I think we
would have gotten into the bridge club somehow. It would have been nice.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But no, that was really interesting to see, because the fact that she was researching at that young age, and then it sort of spins into let's start with the true crime, because that has been a lifelong obsession of mine. But I don't know if we even really would have considered it true crime at the time. Things like Helter Skelter, the book, or any of that kind of stuff that you would chase down. And then later on, I would check into hotel rooms, and I would just turn on A&E, or now it's like HLN. I'm not sure what it is, but it's Cold Case Files, Forensic Files, City Confidential, Bill Curtis, just like I want Bill Curtis to narrate my life,
Yes.
And now it's just like you turn on whichever channel and you just watch murder. And my favorite thing is watching it and going, that's where you fucked up. It's
so true. It's so true. I was watching something the other night and I was like, that's it. I can see your misstep. And it's like, I don't know that I should have this knowledge. But
well, it really does create an interesting conversation about, is this teaching people, like, although in reality, it's getting harder and harder to get away with this stuff because of, watching the Golden State Killer story unfold, even though how many years was he inactive? 30, 20?
Oh yeah. Which is such a wild thing to think about. Think about that. Like, it's like, well, I had my killing years, and then I got that I got my yayas out, and then I went and lived a nice suburban life. Like, it's that's such a like chilling story to me, because also it's like that idea that you never really know anybody, like his family, his wife, his kids. I mean, what a trip that must be.
And what was the other guy? I mean, there's so many examples of guys who just kind of like did stuff, but still had this other, the Green River. What was that guy's?
Yes.
Yeah, like church going. Like they caught him through his church email. It's like, what? But it really is fascinating as you watch these, and like, I'm only kidding, but when I watch these, because most of the time murder, it seems like the giant proportion of murders aren't really planned. It's a passion thing. It's a heat of the moment thing. Then there's a cleanup process that is impossible to sort out, as we know, just paying attention to forensic stuff and CSI and all that kind of stuff. But it is funny to watch these things and think like, well, what I would do, and stroke your beard about it. Yeah,
exactly. It's like what I would do. I could never be in that position.
No.
I think people always ask me, they're like, why are you personally fascinated with serial killers and true crime? And I think for me, it's that I just can't, like, I live in California. There's roaches. Like, I can't kill a roach. I hate roaches. I can't kill them. Like, I can't. Trying to put myself in that psychology and that mindset is so difficult for me, that I think that for me, that's the fascination, is what drives someone to do it. What's the psychology behind it? And yeah, I don't think I would ever find myself in that position, because I just can't imagine like actually being able to do it. So that's a big part of it for me. And then I think for a lot of people too, for a lot of our listeners anyway, a lot of people are just passionate about wanting to solve the unsolved ones. I think that that's a huge driving force. And the pandemic, I think, brought that out in a lot of people. That it was like, let's get into this. We got nothing but time.
Yeah, exactly. Let's solve all these unsolved crimes. Yeah. My wife and I, like, she likes that stuff too. But what always makes me giggle is because she's actually, she's such a kind-hearted person that it's like when we get into things like unsolved mysteries, which I know you guys started on that.
Yeah.
I'm like, you realize this is unsolved, because it's one thing to watch a story that has the arc of like And then they found the fingerprints, and then they connected the DNA,
Right.
and then that's the guy. He's in jail. Whatever. The end.
Right.
But when it's we don't know. We still don't know that, and that's. I don't know what the percentile is, but I assume there's a larger percentage of unsolved stuff than there is solved in its own way, and that's terrifying. And that's where you get these internet sleuths now, who are a whole community unto itself.
Yeah. And the Cecil Hotel documentary, I don't know if you guys watched that one.
Yeah.
But what I found so interesting about that was I was like, I feel like this is so much less about the Elisa Lam case and is more about kind of, bringing to light the level of web sleuthing that some people are doing and how it can kind of get in the way of actual police investigations, and how kind of risky that is, and how it can hurt people's lives and hurt kind of the process. And I feel like it's, what we do is so much more benign than that. We're looking up stuff. And I was like, I don't know if you guys have watched The Widower. It's this recent Dateline 3-parter. And if you
I've heard about it,
you're going to want to, because it's a good one. But we just recorded that episode, and there's another podcast that's hosted by two gals, and they interviewed him within the past few months from prison. And I was like, you know what? I think that crosses a line for me. I was like, I don't know that I actually want to talk to the killers. Like, I don't know that's interesting to me. I don't know that I want to take that step really into the ring.
No.
You know what I mean? Like, I think studying it, again, trying to get into the mindset maybe. But yeah, I don't know that I want to be an active participant in the person's story, if that makes sense.
I have a friend from Regina, Saskatchewan, who interacted with Charles Manson his entire life.
No.
He put out a book about it. I mean, self-published or whatever. He was just he's just a regular dude. I think he was a nurse or, whatever, but he just, like anybody, had this fascination with Manson.
Right.
And he interacted with him for his whole life. So I'm like you. I remember being in Los Angeles, in Hollywood. I was at the GIT, Guitar Institute of Technology. For whatever reason. This is quite a while ago. Age of Electric was playing in Los Angeles. That's why we were rehearsing there. And this guy points at this painting and goes, Tex Watson painted this painting. I go, like Tex Watson from the Manson family? He goes, yeah. And I go, and it was a bizarre story of how it ended up here on the wall. And I'm like, what? I go, but the fact that I knew who that was, and I was sort of like, oh, wow, but I still don't really have that kind of, I'm like you. It's kind of like, we could hop in a car and just drive up to where the Manson, the Sharon Tate house was. I'm not really like, that's interesting, but it's not quite the same for me. Like, I'm not, like, I know people who name their dog, this dog's name is Ramirez and that one's name is Dahmer. And you're like, dude, really? Like, I don't really, I'm not like a fan. I don't watch the Night Stalker documentary going, isn't he cool? Like when they get groupies and stuff, you're like, what is wrong with people? Like,
I know, it's such an interesting line. And I always, watching that one too with those gals, I was like, that's also the psychological thing I want to delve into. Like, let's talk. What's really going on with you? What's this really about?
Exactly.
I don't think you really have an interest in this person. And if you do, we do need to do some work together.
Yeah.
But I'm also, I don't know, like, I'm also like weird about energies. And I'm like, I get, when we were researching our episode where we talked about the Night Stalker, I was like, I can't go too far into the demon research personally.
Yeah.
Because then I get like superstitious and I'm like, I don't know how much, to what extent I believe or disbelieve, but I believe enough that I don't want to mess around.
You don't want to go there. Yeah, I know what you mean.
There, just in case is my point.
Exactly.
I'm not saying I necessarily believe it, but just in case it is real, I'm not gonna.
Well, it's funny growing up. I don't know what it was like for you, but growing up in Saskatchewan, and I'm sure if Christy was here, she could attest to this. But I went through a whole phase of the Golden State Killer, Michelle McNamara's book, and all that kind of stuff, which is all a whole other that documentary on HBO is you got to check that out.
Amazing.
Anybody who hasn't seen that. But I went through a whole phase of that, and the Night Stalker, and all these different stories. I'm thinking when I was a kid, and I don't know what it was like in Belleville, but we didn't lock our houses. I don't even know if at night we locked the door. I mean, I think I could have literally wandered around town and just walked into people's houses and made a sandwich and then left. But they say that when you're watching, or the say Golden State Killer stories or like that, like in Sacramento or in Woodland Hills or like anywhere in the valley, would be like they would just not lock their doors because it was literally like Mayberry or the 8 is enough kind of world, and you're like, and it's funny how quickly when you fast forward now, and I literally would watch the Night Stalker documentary and get up and make sure everything's locked. Yeah.
Us too. It was like, we're just going to make sure that this is all secure. Okay, great.
100%.
I know. It's
and I wonder, as a woman, does that not just, I mean, not just as a woman, I'm saying, but like, because it seems like, the focus of so much of this ire comes to women, is like, does it add an extra angle of like, yeesh, scariness?
It does for me. And when I've gone through bits where I've lived alone as an adult, I go on true crime lockdown. I don't engage in the content. Anytime I've lived alone as a single woman, I can't go there, because it does start to, and then every creak you hear, you know what I mean? Like it's terrifying. And I don't know now whether it's my large consumption of that content has also made me like hyper vigilant, but like I have stuff hidden around the house. Like there are strategically placed pepper sprays around the house. There's a couple of like stun gun taser things hidden around the house that only me and my boyfriend know where they are. It's like, which sounds ridiculous, but I'm like, again, I don't know. I hope we never get into that position, but if we do, we've got stuff. But still, like a good Canadian, we're not purchasing a real gun. You know what I mean?
It's so funny, because I was thinking about your Superstore episode about the firearms and all that kind of conversation, because your character is the exact opposite of that.
Totally.
And we're like that too. It's like it's oddly enough, my father-in-law, Hamilton, Ontario, he is a huge gun guy. And it's like, it's funny to think like he's a Canadian gun guy. So people just assume that all Canadians are, but he's one of those guys. But we're not interested in that. I've always been kind of like, no, I can barely work the toaster. It's like, I can just imagine,
But it's funny too, because for American friends of mine here, I'll talk to like, extremely liberal people who whatever, and they're like, oh yeah, we have a gun. Oh, absolutely, we have a gun. Yeah. And I'm like, really? Like it's such a, and there's absolutely gun people in Canada. That is 100% true. But I just think like a casual gun is more common for everyday people in the United States than it is back home, from my knowledge anyway. Like a casual handgun, I'm like, really? Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. And it's like, defend yourself, defend your family. I totally understand the premise behind it. It's just sort of like where we grew up, at least where I grew up, I assume that we have a similar across the country kind of thing, is just kind of like, oh, that's just not a thing, but I don't really judge. I don't really care, because it's like, because you have the friend who has one, then you got the friend who's got a whole room full of them, and you're like, oh, okay, you're like, I'm fascinated by all different walks of life, and I think these last 4 years have been a definite experiment in like, coexisting in every, half your friends are Nazis according to one half, and the other half are commies according to one half. So you're kind of like,
totally.
And you're like, okay, I'm just going to be here in the middle, kind of doing my thing.
Absolutely, 100%.
So let's jump into that, because as a Canadian living in the U.S. and it's, if for whatever reason, I remember standing in line to update my driver's license in Las Vegas, because I live in Las Vegas. Right. And it's funny when you're standing there, and I look around and everybody's got their passport, and I just couldn't believe how many Canadians were down there. You got to take into account Cirque du Soleil, Celine Dion's band. There's 7 different Cirque shows in Vegas. So
right.
So it was really kind of fascinating and the way we all corral together. Like I go over to my friend's house and he's got April Wine playing. I'm like, I get it, we're Canadian,
I know. I know. But Canadian Thanksgiving here is a big thing too in LA. Like it's like, and then it's like the one time a year I'll see the like, the out kind of liars of other Canadians that I know, but it's true. We somehow find each other. I'm a member of like random Canadian and LA groups on Facebook, and there's, now not because of obviously pandemic quarantine stuff, but prior to that, it's so true. We find each other. It's like and then people that you don't even really know. I have met up with so many women, especially if it's like, a friend of a friend of a friend. She's new. She's coming to LA. She's new. Will you meet? And I'm like, of course. Yes. I'll meet her. Yes, of course. Send me her info. Which is kind of nice, because people did that for me too when I first moved out.
So what is the, I was going to get into how you got to LA, but let's go back, because what I'm really curious about is growing up in Canada. And I don't know if you're like me. Like I literally, like I stop once in a while and I'll go like, this is my 3rd time in Moscow. And I'll go like, it may as well be Tatooine. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, because I grew up in a small town in Saskatchewan, and then it's like, whoa, how did this happen? But this bizarre sort of journey from just, Belleville, Ontario, which is, is a, it's not a, I mean, I guess you're relatively close to Toronto per se, but
2 hours, two
yeah,
hours
so
east. Yeah.
it's not really a small town, but it's a smaller place.
Yeah.
But is it what brings you into, like, I'm going to get into comedy, I'm going to get into was it acting first? I mean, I'm wondering about that. Like, is it like you get into plays first and you realize you're kind of funny, so then you kind of find yourself kind of going into that world, improv type situation, or how does that all come about?
It's interesting for me because I was a painfully shy child, like to the point that my mother was worried. Were
Me
you really
too.
too?
Me too. Yeah,
That's
I
so
didn't speak.
interesting.
I didn't speak in kindergarten. My
I
friends,
barely did. I
my
barely did.
I had a friend who would say, they do like the roll call, and he's here. I wouldn't speak. It was like the funniest thing. Yeah.
That's so funny because yeah, I was very similar and my mother was very worried when I was a kid because she was like, this is a problem. And she was a single mom and I wasn't around a lot of men and I was terrified of men for no real reason, I think, other than I just didn't grow up with them to the age of like 4.
Right.
So my mother put me in modeling classes in Belleville, Ontario. And I will credit her that for whatever reason, it worked in that I loved it for some reason, like walking a little runway and like doing my little poses and stuff. It was very, very, very kind of small potatoes. It wasn't like toddlers and tiaras or anything like that.
Yeah.
But I would do like the little local pageants where again, we just looked like little kids. They weren't like putting makeup on us and stuff like that. It was more just very innocent.
Sure.
But it really did kind of like snap me out of it. And then I was 7 years old. And I always tell this story when people are like, what started your like interest in performing? It was my grandparents' 40th wedding anniversary. And they rented a video camera because we were humble folks and we didn't own one. And it was the first time I had ever seen a video camera. I was like 7 years old. Yeah, 7. And all I knew was that I wanted to be in front of that camera. And like to the point that it was like my mother, again, I'm this shy child who she's like, pulling out of her shell so hard. And then all of a sudden this camera goes on and I'm like, just wanting to be like on it. And I started doing a Robin Leach impression, like Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. But I did this bit that's Lifestyles of the Poor and Boring. And I'm like, for a 7-year-old, that's kind of a funny bit. Like it's kind of a smart bit for a little kid.
That would have played in the 80s for real.
Right? It totally would have played in the 80s. Yeah. Put me on In Living Color, for God's sake.
Mad TV. Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So that was honestly, again, the modeling classes and then being in front of this camera for the first time, those were the turning points. And then that was it. And I was like, I want to be a performer. I want to do plays. And I was in grade 4 when I got cast in my first school play. It was called When the Hippos Crashed the Dance. And I got the lead, believe it or not, Professor Owl, which was a real joy.
Yeah.
And then it kind of went from there and I did school plays. And then I started doing community theater. So my mom was into community theater because my mom also wanted to be an actress, but then kind of went the more practical route.
Right.
Instead of kind of pursuing that. And she also, as a side note, has decided that in her retirement, she's going to get back into it. And I couldn't be happier for her. I think
that's awesome.
So cute. So yeah. And so then I started doing community theater, like into the beginning of high school. And then that's when I got my first agent. And so they would, bless my mother, she would drive me 2 hours to Toronto to audition for commercials.
Wow.
And music videos and all that kind of thing. And when I was 15, I think, I booked my first commercial, which was Tylenol Menstrual. Come on.
Yeah, that's a good stage name, by the way.
Right? Hello, everyone. I'm Tylenol Menstrual. And then I booked a second commercial, and my agent at the time told my mom, just audition for it as well. And she booked it too. So she's also got one under her belt, which is
that's great.
Very nice.
Wow.
Too funny. So yeah, and then that was just like it. Like I was super hyper focused, and the comedy kind of just was always there. Like I remember the like other turning point in my child brain was watching Clue, and Madeline Kahn playing Mrs. White. And I remember as like a little kid putting together, and this is so wild, that I was like this is the first time the woman has been the funniest one. And I get it, that's
Right.
subjective, but to me was the funniest one. And it like stuck with me that I was like, oh, I want to do that. Like, I want to be as funny as her. Like, and that was like, yeah. So those were kind of like the stepping stones to then when I got to high school, um, I got a full scholarship because I was actually like a super really good student. Like I was like valedictorian of my high school, best all around student, like one of
Great.
those types. And I went to theater school and had a terrible time.
Really?
And yeah, it was really stifling. There's been a lot of kind of questionable in the years since, there's been a lot of questionable, you know, the ways that they were teaching were not necessarily the best. You know, they would give notes that were, in my opinion, highly inappropriate, like, and not
Really?
helpful. Yeah. So the system was kind of built so you were going to school like 80 hours a week. So there was
Wow.
like no time to sleep, no time to do the homework they assigned, and they did it so that you would fail. They did it so that you would not be able to complete everything you were supposed to, and it was all this huge mind game. And then I
Wow.
would get notes like um, the note that I'll never forget, and this was a turning point for me too. Uh, my acting teacher said, "Were you raised by a single father?" And I said, "No." And he was like, "Because you come off like a steely Jodie Foster Dyke whose dad never combed her hair."
Wow. That's constructive.
Isn't that
Wow. How
wild?
many careers or like loves of acting and theater did they crush? Can you imagine? I
Well,
mean,
you know what? Honestly, I think so many. And it was kind of getting to the point, I was only a few months in, and I started to get to the point where I was like, I don't know if I'm meant to do this. And there was that little voice inside of me that was like, no, get out of here. And I called my mom, I'll never forget. And I was like, I think I need to quit. And she's like, I think you do too. And so I quit school, got like literally just walked away from a free ride. Literally all 4 years were paid for. And I
sure.
forfeited the whole scholarship. And I got on the subway in Toronto from the theater school and got off at Second City and signed up for improv classes. And less than a year later, I was the youngest woman ever hired to the touring company at the Second City.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, I really hope more people can hear that because
Yeah.
there's so many different things that crush, and that, you know, showbiz in general is all about just being like trying to stay strong through just the worst, you know, like, and
Yes.
so many actors going to just audition after audition after audition, and just kind of like, you know, it's 99% no, and then 1% sure, you know, as long as that 1% fills your soul, you know, you're kind of
Yes.
okay. Not, it's not like that for everybody, but the fact that you listen to yourself, because there's probably people who did that entire 4 years and just went into accounting because it was like, F this, I'm not doing that. But
Totally.
so now we get into Second City, which I'm really excited about too, because it's, so you've already got a background in acting. So, because I wonder about this, because a lot of my friends who do stand up, and a lot of, you know, they just fall ass backward in some acting gig because, you know, and they don't really have a background in, you know, where your mark is or any of that kind of stuff. And but you've at least got a background in. But the interesting thing, the difference between, at least my objective view of the difference, is acting is like, these are the words, remember these, say them with passion. Now you go into improv and it's like, it's just completely jazz, like, go, just you follow that guy's lead and just do your thing. I find it really intimidating. I've never done anything like that. So, but I'm a huge fan of that Second City, you know, and all the SNL thing that it led to in its own, in a different way, I guess. But so
Yeah.
how does that happen? So you take classes? Is that what that is?
Yeah. So I signed up for improv classes, and yeah, there's, you know, it's really it kind of blew up in Toronto around that time too. Like people were starting to really get into improv as like an art form or whatever you want to call it. And it's really cool because for me, you know, in theater school, they were trying to like give us these different tools to like, for example, to like make yourself cry or be able to cry on command. And I just couldn't do it. Like I couldn't connect to it, and it wasn't working for me, and it just wasn't the way in for me. But when I got into improv and I started just being in the moment, and because improv, of course, is, you know, a lot of it is, of course, comedy based. But for me, it changed the game for me as an actor because it allowed me to like be in the moment, be in a scene with somebody and connect with them and really connect with them. And then all of a sudden, I felt like I had access to all of these emotions that just were there all of a sudden, in a way that I'd never experienced before. So for me, in terms of like my overall kind of actor journey, improv really has been a huge part of it, not only because of the comedy stuff, which I'll get to in a second, but because as an actor, I just feel like it really, that's what works for me. And different things work for different actors, but for me, like being able to connect in the moment and really just feel like I'm living in this character and in this moment with this person, that sounds so pretentious, but it's true. It's just easier for me to feel than it is to like, okay, think about that time when you were a kid and that terrible thing happened to you. And like, you know what I mean? Like it takes me out of it. Like I can't, how does that relate to like playing this scene that's about something completely different, you know? So yeah, so I started taking classes. I got hired to the touring company, and then you're touring like middle of nowhere, Northern Ontario, mostly into like, rural Manitoba.
Wow.
Yeah, we did a real tour. I toured for 3.5 years, I think. And so basically the way the shows are set up is the first half of every show is existing sketches that people in the past Second City history have written. And then the second half of the show is improv. So the cool thing is that when you're in the touring company, you're performing scenes by like Second City royalty. So like I was doing scenes by like Tina Fey and Rachel Dratch, Amy Poehler, like, those were kinds of that was the source material we were working with. And then the second half of every show, yeah, it's like jazz. It's exactly what you're saying. And when you're touring with the same people, you kind of get this like shorthand. And it's not that we were ever, because people always think at improv, it's like, oh, do you pre-plan it though? Are you cheating? And it's like, no, we're not cheating. But the cheat is that you just perform with everybody. And I'm sure, much like when you're performing with the same band every night, you start to get into that, kind of organic rhythm. Like,
Right.
I know that if, Leslie looks at me a certain way, she's going to do a certain character, or, you know what I mean? Like it just kind of turns into that, which is a really cool kind of creative environment to come in when you're really young and starting out, because it feels like anything's possible. And so I toured for 3.5 years, and then I got promoted to the main stage in Toronto. And then you start using improv to write your sketches. So
Right.
creating the same kind of source material like we were touring. And then what happens is you write over the course of a few months, a show that's 2 acts of sketches and 1 act of improv. And so I wrote 4 shows while I was on the main stage in Toronto. And again, in Toronto specifically too, and then I also went on to work in Chicago at Second City there, but Toronto is very heavily based in improv.
Yeah.
It's really like you come in with an idea, a premise that's like, one of mine was, what happens when Carla Homolka gets out of jail and needs a roommate? That was a premise that I brought.
Wow.
And
wow.
and we did it, and we just, myself and this other actor, Paul Bates, we did it and we improvised it. And there was something about it that worked. It was super dark. And it was also like, but there's something that's like real about that. Like, wow, like what would she do when she gets out of prison,
Yeah.
And so, but then over the course of the 2-month kind of writing process, you hone it and figure out what it needs. And what we learned that it needs is we need him saying all the things that the public wants to say to her. The
Right.
whole time, right.
Sure,
So it became him
yeah.
going like, you're such a monster. You should have died for what you did. Are these cathedral ceilings? Like it was like that idea of like the push-pull between like, can I live with this person? Because this apartment is great. And it's so cheap.
In-suite laundry? That's great. Yeah.
And it's only $1,200 a month.
Yeah, wow.
Ooh,
Okay.
you killer. I hate you so much. But there's free parking. So again, that's like a good example of like, you bring an idea that's also risky and like, who knows if this could work. And then you like through improv and trying it a bunch of different ways. We probably tried it 50 different ways. By the time opening night of the show comes, you've got this like sketch that then the scripts are only ever written after the show is opened, because we just improvise them until we open, and then they document them for like the archives
so
after
insane.
the show is open. Yeah, and it's so cool. Now, then I went on to work at the Second City main stage in Chicago.
That's
which
so
is
cool
really,
that
like,
you
the Holy
yeah.
Land.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's like
and
the
that,
Graceland of
it is, and and listen, like it's not lost on me. I was one of like 4 Canadians only ever to do the main stage there. Like it's
Who are
wild.
they? Like Mike Myers, something like
Mike
that?
Myers, John Candy,
Sure.
a woman named Lisa Brooke,
Okay.
who went back and she works in television in Canada now, and
Okay.
myself.
Wow, that's crazy. That's
It's-
so cool.
It's so
That's good
cool.
company.
And it's pretty cool company for sure. But the process there is similar, but there, first of all, the pressure is just immense because you're at the like top of that world.
You're like, it's like the Royal Shakespeare kind of thing. Like it's one thing doing Shakespeare at home and then you go to London and you're suddenly, okay, you know.
Totally. Wow. And so there was also more of a kind of emphasis on coming in with pre-written sketches, which was cool and fine and like a different way of working. But it was the one kind of big difference that I noticed between Toronto and Chicago. And then of course, the other big difference I noticed was just the sensibility of comedy in Canada versus America, which is fascinating. Like
that's
the science of,
like Karla Homolka would be lost on them. Probably
completely lost. But also like, I don't know that if you translated that to a similar thing here, I don't know that it would work. In Canada, it's like, we love to laugh at ourselves. We love to make fun of ourselves. We're totally cool with self-deprecation. But what I found on stage here in Chicago was like, I would try stuff kind of like gently poking fun at Americans. I did a sketch that was just like, it was basically just about Americans being loud and to silence. Like literally like silence. And then I came off stage and my castmates who are all American were like, oh yeah, that's not going to work. No. I was like, oh, okay. Like,
well, the Americans weren't loud during that sketch, I guess.
Yeah. But it was such an interesting thing. But the one common denominator was you can make fun of Canadians and Americans will laugh. So that is a shared.
Sure. Yeah. That is a shared reality. Yeah. I see it all the time on films. It's like that one, people always bring up that one Simpsons episode where the kid goes, well, we just moved down from Canada and people think I'm slow, eh? And you're like, okay, that's not the case, but fair enough. But it's interesting, you brought up so many different things that I want to talk about because, well, actually, you know what? It's interesting to think about, like, it would be interesting if you guys touched on some of because we always think of like serial killers and all these terrible murders and things like that being not largely an American thing. It's just that it's a exponential, more things happen. But there are some fascinating Canadian murder stories. And the one you brought up with Karla Homolka, and what was his name?
Paul Bernardo.
Paul Bernardo, who... he was married to this woman named Karla Homolka. They would videotape and murder and rape women. And it really went to the darkest of dark places by involving her sister. And and it just goes on from there. I watched the documentary not that long ago about how how did that work? I'm going to totally go into a whole other world here. So we can edit this out. I don't care.
I love it. No, listen, I'm on board.
where she said, she basically, the deal that was worked out with the police or the investigators was like, she got on their team and threw him under the bus. And then when they finally saw the videotapes, they realized she was hauled to his oats. You know what I mean? Like,
oh yeah.
Yeah. She was like
just as culpable. Yes.
She was 100% involved, but the deal was made. And I don't know if that's a Canadian law thing or what, but she basically served time, but she's been out for years. And from what I understand, she moved to somewhere far away, Honduras or some crazy place, and remarried, had children. And this documentarian went over there and found her and tried to explain to the other church members, this is who this person is. And they sort of landed on this, like, look, she's, in our belief system, we have to forgive. And I'm like, okay, but it is a dark ass story. That one in there. And there's also in Vancouver, there was the Picton Farms. I don't know if you ever heard that story, but about a bunch of murdered prostitutes who were bodies were fed to pigs and stuff like that. So it's always these things that we think about, but Canada is so much better at, like, this happened, squash. It's just kind of, let's move on.
Yeah.
And we talk about it, but it never seems to get that kind of, I don't know, glorified kind of thing.
I agree. And I remember certainly during the Bernardo stuff, I remember there was a certain amount of media blockage that I remember like friends of mine's parents had gotten like American newspapers to like get the juicy details of everything that was going on, because the Canadian media had put like a ban that they weren't going to cover the details of the case.
Do you think that's for legal reasons? What do you think?
I think part of it was they didn't want to try and taint the jury selection or the jury that was going on.
It's kind of brilliant, really.
I don't even know. But yeah, it's interesting that they really kind of tried to keep as much of it out of our media as possible. So I think that that's part of why they kind of just slip away. And then when you kind of start to look back at all the Canadian serial killers, it's like, oh, we've got a pretty long list. It's more than you'd think.
There was a dude that like killed and ate somebody on a Greyhound bus. Did you hear that story?
Yeah.
You know, it's like, it's
Yeah.
fascinating. It's funny because when I watched the Cecil Hotel story, you know, and I don't want to give too much away, but I guess I will be giving away by this next story. But for the longest time, there was a lifelong urban myth that in Melville, Saskatchewan, there was a dead body in the water tower for a long time. And I've tried to
Oh.
research this because I was explaining this to my wife, and she went in, and she's so much smarter than me, but she gets into she just found it like kind of mentioned in an urban myth kind of thing. But it was an interesting thing because the urban myth was more like a universal urban myth that also mentioned Melville, Saskatchewan's body in the tower. So it didn't seem to have an actual, you know, like it was a true story. It just seemed like it was a
Right.
thing, you know. So,
Oh, that's
but
wild.
yeah, but I mean, these kind of things go on. But anyway, so you get to Chicago, which honestly, as a fan of this world, and I've been watching SNL since as far back as I can remember as a kid,
Yeah.
and I've just always been fascinated with, like, because even to this day, when people say to me SNL sucks now, you know, and I'm one of those guys that I've dug so deeply into what that world is, and being able to write like a show in a week sounds awful. Like, it doesn't sound like anything, and so much trauma was involved in all those people doing that. But the creative aspect of, like you say, being in the moment, because it's literally, if there's three of you in the scene, you're all such an important part of it that you don't want to be the one that drops the ball. Like, you kind of like uh, don't know what to say next or whatever kind of thing, which I'm sure in the early days of doing it, there's going to be moments of like trepidation. But clearly by the time you get to Chicago, you've got your 6th-degree black belt and you're ready to move up into the Shaolin Temple or whatever the hell it is.
Yeah.
So what is that? How long are you in Chicago for? There's another interesting thing, living in Chicago versus, were you living in Toronto when you were you must have been living in Toronto doing the Toronto thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So
So,
I had lived in Toronto for many years,
mhm.
like leading up, like out of high school, basically, and then into my time at Second City there. And then I moved to Chicago 2008, I believe, and I was there for 2 years. And they run their shows a lot longer. So in Toronto, we would open a show, it would run for about 4 months, and then you start writing a new one. So they're kind of turning shows over kind of more often. When I was there in Chicago, the first show that I was in ran for over a year. So it's also interesting because when we're writing the sketch portion of the show, it's supposed to be topical, kind of timely in the moment or of the time. And that makes it a little bit difficult because stuff is changing. The news cycle changes, rapidly, especially in this country. So that was kind of an interesting experience running a show for over a year, and how we kind of had to go in and change some things that we had written over the course of that year, just because they were no longer making sense. Or also, like, jokes change. They hit differently at different times. Again, it turns into like the science of comedy. Like, the number 7 is always going to get a laugh more than the number 5. That is the weirdest thing, but I can attest to it. Like,
Really
yeah, it's so weird.
fascinating.
And that's just from my own experience. If you're in a scene and it's like you have to say whatever, like, give me blank amount of whatever, it's like 7 will always get a hit. It's so weird. I don't know why. But again, it's like those little things that when you perform every night of the week for, whatever it was for me, 7 years, 8 years, you start to learn these like weird little like scientific nuggets that make no sense. But it was interesting because I moved to Chicago. I'm obviously very gregarious and friendly, and I thought I would have no problem making kind of a circle of friends. And it was really tough because I was in this new city. There was a certain amount of jealousy, I think, from some people in the system because I came kind of seemingly from nowhere. Now, granted, at that point, I also had, a lot of experience under my belt, but
Sure.
to other people who are working their way up in that system, I'm sure it was annoying that some Canadian shows up and takes a job. I get it. And then of course, when you're writing the show, you're there for, 4 to 5 hours a day. And then you do the show at night. That's like 2.5 hours. And I always said, I felt like I was at comedy camp for a large
Yeah.
period of time there. And the
Yeah.
writing processes are longer there too. So we were writing for there was like 3 months of time where it was like, you got up at 10, you got to work at 1, and you got home at like 1 in the morning. Like, it was like
Wow.
12-hour days of, of this stuff in one way or another. And so it was a really interesting time. And it kind of just became all consuming because, again, I felt like I didn't really have a large friend group while I was there, other than the people I was working with who were great.
Right.
But then also, you know, you're working together every day. So it's like, you don't want to be like, hey, do you want to hang out like for another few hours? You know, that's weird.
Sit around and talk about what you just talked about for
yeah,
12 hours. Yeah.
Exactly. It's like, we got nothing left. We got nothing left, Ashley. Come on. But it's interesting because my dream was always to be on SNL. Like that was like the goal for me was to get SNL. And I had somehow at that point, I was like, I could do this. Like it was all of a sudden the unattainable goal and dream was really within my reach. Tangible. And I remember Lorne Michaels came to one of our shows to recruit because they came Canadian. Thank you very much. They came usually once or twice a year to Second City to just see shows and then decide who they wanted to give auditions to. And the other two girls in my show got flown out and I did not. God. And it was a moment where, again, it was kind of like, okay, well, I had my at bat and I definitely struck out. And that's not a testament to like my ability or lack of ability at all. It was more just, you get some, like you were saying before, you got to do a lot of auditions before you book one. And so it was a moment for me though, where I kind of had to recalibrate because I had come very close to achieving something that I had wanted since I was probably 9 years old. Yeah. I didn't. Yeah. And there was kind of like no other, it wasn't like, you know, if you're trying to be a lawyer and you fail the LSAT, I'm sure you can take it again. It isn't really that with SNL, if that makes sense. And some people audition multiple times and then eventually get it. But for me, it just didn't happen. And there was, you know, it just never came around. And so that was like a definite moment for me of like, okay, well, you now need to like recalibrate. What do you want to do? Right. Yeah. What's your dream now? Like, what's your goal? Because
well, it's interesting that you bring that up though, because it would be kind of like being a musician and take your pick, Aerosmith or Kiss are looking for somebody. And I didn't get that gig. And I just thought, well, I don't got that. So I'm just going to go home and retire. It's like, because SNL sure is, I don't know, the Paul McCartney or something level of things to attain to, but it's just one of a million things. You know, I mean, like there's a million other, and clearly you've found your own Aerosmith or Kiss. I'm speaking in rock and roll terms here. I'm sorry.
Well, listen, I'm fully on board, believe me. But yeah, it's so true. And it's just, I think when you're on that path, because specifically sketch comedy,
of course,
you know, Mad TV didn't really exist anymore. I think at that point, there wasn't a lot of gigs, and it's like SNL was kind of like, that's the gig. And if you don't get it, it's like, oh shoot, well, what am I gonna?
And it was always the mecca anyway, even when there was a Mad TV or a Living Color or any of that kind of stuff. So yeah. But then, so what happens after Chicago? Like, so you do 2 years there, and
I do 2 years there, and then I was like, you know what? I think, and I didn't get SNL. I didn't even get an audition. So I was like, you know what? I think I'm gonna stop. At that point, I had written 2 shows there, 4 in Toronto, so that's 6, and I had done about 8 years of, you know, between 7 and 8 shows a week. It was like, I think I'm ready for a break.
That sounds rough. That sounds rough. I mean, people think about showbiz as being like, you know, oh great, you just show up, and it's like, you know, when you actually like talk about your day, I just go, oh God, it's like your social life is ruined. There's no personal life at all, really. It's like, you know,
they don't want to let you take time off. So it's like you miss weddings, you miss funerals, you know, it becomes all consuming. And then for me, I discovered that I had severe acid reflux because I started getting nodes on my vocal cords.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, you know, I had done enough training that I was like, I'm really like, I feel like I'm, you know, speaking properly and using kind of like vocal training. And it was like, no, you have this like severe acid reflux. So then it was also like trying to manage that by, you know, by the end of an 8-show week, I would barely have a voice. Wow. Every week. And it's like, you know, just trying to kind of like hobble your way through by the end of the 8 years, you know. So it was also like, I think it was also important at that point for me to like, I think you really just need to take a break because you're starting to break down physically.
So do you go back to Toronto at that point?
I go back to Toronto and I start doing some film and TV there. And I did a television show, a series called Almost Heroes, which only ran for 1 season, a Canadian show.
I remember that show.
Yeah.
And a lot of my friends are actors, so I'm kind of always aware. It seems like I'm as aware of the music as I am as the film and television stuff that goes on up there because of my friends in both fields, you know?
Right. Yeah. So that was really, really fun. And then I came to LA. This is another like classic, Hollywood story. I came to LA for a pilot season, as many actors do.
Mhm.
And I was auditioning for some things, but I wasn't really getting many auditions. And I was like, oh man, like this isn't that great. So I auditioned for a show called Super Fun Night. And I came very, very close. Like
Wow.
I was the choice, but then it turned into this whole thing about, she's never done an American show before. Just, is she good enough? And it's like, I've been doing this now for 10 years. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, about 10 years.
6th-degree black belt, Shaolin Temple.
Well, this is the thing. So we're cutting together like sizzle reels of me and demo reels of me and like sending all of this stuff. I didn't book it. And it was, heartbreaking. And then I got into this car accident that was serious, but not, life-threatening, but I was in the hospital for a few days. And it was one of those things where I was like, you know what? I think I'm going to go back home for a bit. I came down, I got very close to something.
You got in a car accident in Los Angeles?
Yeah. On April Fool's Day.
Oh, of course. Of course.
Of course. But it was like, you're in a hospital bed in Los Angeles, California. Los Angeles is isolating at the best of times, but that was like, I just had this moment where I was like, I don't think it's my time. I don't think it's my time yet. And so I went back to Toronto and kind of was like, I think I'm just gonna, and then it was, the Super Fun Night thing came back. Well, maybe they are interested in you. And then it became again, this whole game of me trying to prove myself and us trying to prove, and then again, it went away again. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to buy a condo. I'm going to just settle down in Toronto. I can go back and do pilot season if I want another time, but I think I'm done for now. This was very stressful. Yeah. And then as soon as I signed the ink on buying that condo, Super Fun Night called a third time. And they had made that pilot at CBS. CBS passed. ABC decided they wanted to make their own version. And then I booked that. And so I ended up getting that gig. But like, again, through so many, it was like 6 months of stress to book that gig. But that was with Rebel Wilson. So it was Rebel, myself, and a gal, Lisa Lapira, were the 3 leads on that show. And we did a season. We did 17 episodes here in LA. And it was on that show, and this is kind of like the full cool moment, that Molly Shannon was guest starring in an episode. And she came up to me at one point because we'd had these scenes together. And obviously I'm like such a fan of hers. And she said, I used to like memorize her Mary Catherine Gallagher bits and like them.
Yeah.
I didn't lead with that with her. But anyway, she came up to me at one point. She goes, why did you never do SNL? And I said, well, I didn't get an audition. I didn't do it. And she goes, you know what? You just skipped a step. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. And
That's
it was such a and I knew that and believed that, but the metaphor of my SNL idol verbalizing that to me in that moment, I was just like, it was just a really like beautiful life moment where it was like, yes, I've come full circle. I am where I'm supposed to be. I am on the right path, which was, very magical.
That's so cool. And it's funny that you bring that up, because before we move too much further into your thing, it really is an interesting conversation, because I guess because I don't really think of it that way by living in the 21st century, that when there was a time where people went like, women aren't funny, they got to be with the funny guy, or, a part of, Mary Tyler Moore's there with Dick Van Dyke. He's hilarious, or whatever. And just watching it, Tina Fey, Amy Poehler, Molly Shannon, the list goes on of people who are just straight up. And like when you brought up Madeline Kahn or even Bette Midler, certain people can be like really just the focal point of the funny. And I think that really, but that must have been interesting growing up and looking at those sort of those markers as like, whether it was Madeline Kahn or whoever, and going like, yeah. But as you're doing this, you must be watching all these other women sort of like really sort of take the lead. The fact that Amy and Tina were the leads in their own shows is a big thing, It
was huge. And, truthfully, throughout my career, my live comedy career, we were constantly, myself and my best friend, Leslie Seiler, we used to do kind of sketch stuff ourselves, like independently on, you know, aside from Second City as well, because when you're in it, you become addicted to it and it's all you want to do all the time. When you're first starting out, especially, but we would constantly, consistently, every show without exaggeration, have men come up to us and say, you know, I never normally find women funny, but you're really funny. And I'm talking like, this is like 2004. Like you would think that at that point, and then even into my main stage years, I remember those comments coming after shows, you know, and you would think like, really, were we still kind of in that era in the mid 2000s? And it's like, yeah. And even now, like, you know, it's funny. It's funny that it's still a conversation. I remember that big Christopher Hitchens article that came out whenever it was maybe even a decade ago now, but it's interesting to me that it's even still a conversation in our lifetime, that it's like really like past when you start to make the list, it's like, there's so much empirical evidence. If you want to look at it again through like the comedy science lens, it's like, it's just, it's wild to think about. And yeah, that was like such a huge part of it. And I think that that's also, for me, that was like a huge motivator, because it was like, I was just angry.
Well, yeah. And I think that's really fascinating because, you know, you're absolutely right. It's absolutely empirically wrong to think like that, because we could probably make a list from Lucy all the way till now and have
totally.
a very strong argument about people who were just funny people, not just, you know, male or female. So now you get into a world that I find fascinating too, because when you're showing up at the CBS lot, or I'm not even sure where that is that like one of the Burbank Paramount type lots or something like that? Like that whole world to me, you know, you're in the dream factory, you know what I mean? Like you're like, you should, there's a, you know, that whole thing to me is just fascinating. And what's the difference? I mean, obviously there's a massive difference between being in the moment with an improv situation to now do that. Is this, none of this stuff that you've done has been in front of a live audience type? That thing seems to be a bit of a lost art, isn't it?
Yeah, I've only ever guest starred on a multicam. I've never.
Which one was that?
It was a Canadian one called Spun Out.
Okay.
It was Dave Foley from Kids in the Hall.
Sure. Yeah.
And that was super fun because it does kind of capture that.
Is that kind of like? Is that kind of more like doing a play in a sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It cut up because you do one scene until you get it and then move on. But yeah, it is much more like. You do you do it more chronologically and yeah, it is much more like doing a play.
Yeah,
you memorize the whole thing like as a whole. Whereas the shows that I work on, like Super Fun Night and Superstore, you shoot out of order and you know, I would never sit down and memorize a Superstore script. No, I would memorize day to day. Like, what am I shooting tomorrow? I'll memorize those scenes.
Does any element of improv come into any of that?
Well, listen, my experience on other shows, no, I have been encouraged in the past on other shows and it was rarely used. Superstore was a different ballgame. Superstore, we improvised a lot. And they
are a lot of the cast with improv backgrounds?
Mixed. So Mark McKinney, who plays Glenn on the show, a Kids in the Hall member, one of my idols.
And Canadian.
Thank you very much. He obviously has a huge background and he and I mean, they were so kind to us because they would, if the two of us were in a scene, they would instruct guest directors to just never call cut, like just let them go. And we would go and we would find stuff and they would use it. And that's like the coolest thing ever. You know, you're on a network show, which is already the dream, and then you're also like getting to do something that's creatively fulfilling feels unbelievable. But then Colton Dunn, who's on the show, he plays Garrett. He has a background in improv as well.
He's so great.
He's so funny.
He's a real standout on there too.
Yeah. And then, you know, a lot of the other people may have comedy backgrounds or acting backgrounds, but what kind of started to happen over the course of 6 years is that people would start to step out a little. And you know, because Mark and I improvised so much that then I would be in a scene with America, for example, who doesn't have that kind of background, but then she would want to play. You know what I mean? Like it's one of those things where it's like, oh, well, you know, it's like being a dog. Where he's like, well, I want to play. And so then she and I would start to go and we would do stuff and we'd find stuff. And it became like, it was such a special experience. Like truly, I from the beginning, I knew what a special opportunity it was, but really just top to bottom, it was a joy. It was,
Well, that's so. Where does the connection between Super Fun Night to Superstore? Like, what you're living in Los Angeles by this point, I assume. Like, you've had to
yes,
completely relocate.
yes,
There's visas involved. There's all that
yes.
stuff. Man, that's one of my favorite conversations with my. Anytime I get into an Uber, every time a guy has an accent, I go, "So how long you been in Vegas?" Because I love hearing the story. Like, well,
Totally.
I've been in Vegas 5 years or so, and then we get into, because they assume I'm American. I just go, I'm from Canada, so I have a crazy story too, and having to get a visa and eventually getting a green card. Da, 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 da. But people don't really realize that, it's like that there's a whole thing involved, and sometimes I think getting a gig that kind of stuff might be weird. I don't know if a lot of people kind of, if they go, well, she's great, but we got to deal with a bunch of paperwork. That person they just live over there, so let's hire them. I mean, I don't know if that's actually the case. But
Oh yeah,
but
it is the case. And in order to get a visa, you need a certain amount of time. So it also depends on when something's shooting. So if you're a Canadian down here and there's a guest star that's happening next week, chances are you're not going to book it because they're not going to be able to get the paperwork done in time. You need a few weeks at least.
Right.
And even then, sometimes it can come down to, I think with mine, it was like the night before, the day before, and you're giving yourself an ulcer because it's like, am I going to be able to go to work? Like, how does, like, I am also like such a rules person. I'm like, I'm not violating, immigration
same.
law.
I was
Not
exactly
happening.
the same. Yeah.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
no, not happening.
I didn't want to deal with that thing of like, oh, I'm just going down for vacation. Nope. No, I didn't want to deal with all that nonsense.
No, I'm not built for it. No, I can't do it. But yeah, so that's absolutely a thing. It's totally real. People lose gigs because of it all the time. Which is why there's always this push that if you're a Canadian going down to LA as an actor to get a green card rather than going without even a visa. If you have a work visa, in order to work on another gig, you need to file an amendment to add that. Like, it still takes time. So a green card's kind of the only way to be able to have flexibility for last minute bookings.
Absolutely.
So that's kind of like the goal. But here is, because again, you're like, oh, Lauren, what a lovely story. You had your ups and your downs. Well, guess what? There's a big down coming.
Great. Ouch.
In the journey. So I had done Super Fun Night, but here's the thing. And people are like, you were on a huge show. Like, you must have been swimming in money. No, not the case. So because it's my first, American gig, they pay me a very small amount of money, which I get. That's fine.
Sure.
But because I am new to America, I don't understand all of the tax rules. I don't understand the corporation rules versus the individual rules and all of those kinds of things. I naively, I guess, filed as a individual for my work rather than opening a corporation, which means I was taxed at about 65%, I think.
Sure.
Somewhere in that range. Then people don't realize, I have to commission an agent. I have to commission a manager. I have to commission another agent. I have to, I didn't have a lawyer at that point, but like the amount of, long story short, by the time I got my gross money, or my net money rather, I didn't really make that much money. And then I was like, well, I want to change this visa that they bought for me into a green card so that if I book something else, I don't have an issue. So that was another $20,000. And then, and I had bought a car because in LA, you need a car to get to work. It's not like back home where if you book a gig, they pick you up every day. They don't.
Or hop on the train, for God's sake, or something.
Right.
Yeah.
Not happening. So when Super Fun Night was finished, I didn't really have that much money left. And then, I was here for a couple of months, and between all of those bills and the tax and whatever, I actually started to go into debt. And I have never talked about this. Here you go. Exclusive scoop.
Exclusive.
I booked the lead on a pilot for NBC. We knew that Super Fun Night was not coming back, but they hadn't announced it yet. And they chose not to let me do the pilot. So basically it was like, well, we don't want the news to get out that Super Fun Night's not coming back yet, so we're not going to let you shoot that pilot.
Oh, wow.
So first of all, it's like devastating because that was the pilot where I would have been the number one lead on the show. So that's sad.
Did that show go on to be anything?
It did not.
Okay, well, that's at least some. It
is. But then also at that point I was like, oh boy, now I'm starting to get a little worried about cash because every month and your bills are a lot higher, et cetera. And so after a few months of this, when they finally released me and I could work again, I was like, I'm starting to go deeper and deeper into debt. Then again, the tax bill comes. I was like, oh my God, I made a huge misstep by not opening a corporation. Long story short, I managed after a few months to get deeply in debt. And I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do. I think I have to go back home. I book a gig back home. I book something here. Long story short, because there's an NDA that I can't violate, there was a scheduling conflict and the gig from back home sued me.
Wow.
Because I couldn't make it for this,
Jeez,
this one
Louise.
day. So now little Lauren Ash is not only thought I had booked something that I was finally going to get my way out of this debt, but now I've gotten sued. So then I got deeper into debt, and then I had to pay for a lawyer and got deeper into debt. So then it becomes, I did a show called Another Period on Comedy Central. I did one season of that, which was amazing because there was so many like cool, like the punk rock stars of the comedy world,
Right. Yeah.
So many cool people on that show.
Like who? Throw them at me. I'm a big comedy nerd. So.
Oh, well, listen, I love the first person, like Christina Hendricks. She wasn't one of the comedy people, but she was there. She was amazing. So it was Natasha Leggero and Ricky Lindholm. It was their show. And it was just a constant, it was like Michael Ian Black, Thomas Lennon. It was just every little part. They just asked like their cool friends to come and do. And I was just like,
amazing.
Oh my God, like everybody was so cool. And then they'd also get cool actors like Lou Diamond Phillips came in and did a storyline.
Wow.
And it was a really kind of cool thing. But I also the entire time was sweating bullets because I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm doing this gig, but I'm also in the process of going through these legal issues.
Man, oh man.
So I come out of that show again, further in debt than when I came in. And I literally was like, you know what? I don't know how much longer I can last here. I think maybe I'll do one more month of auditioning. I think we were like back to a pilot season at that point, maybe. And then I got to go home, and then I booked Superstore. And
wow.
So, yeah. And so it was really kind of like, it was such a saving grace also at that point. But obviously when you book the pilot, you don't know whether it's going to get picked up yet or
That's
not.
true.
But I was fairly certain, just reading the script, I was like, A, how does this show not already exist?
Yeah.
And B, I was like, I just know that it will. Like, I just knew when I saw that, I was like, this is the answer to my problems. And it's a really cool project, but I was like, this is going to be it. And I was luckily correct.
But it's an interesting story because it really does show you, like, when people go like, how did this happen to this person? Because it happens so many times where people are like, they've done something, but are broke, or,
Yeah.
and often, or sports, like one divorce and a couple other bad investments, and a guy can be wiped out. And it's really interesting to hear that. And I'm so thankful that you kind of, but it's almost kind of like it's your talent that really kind of got you out of these situations, that inevitably you would find something like this. So
Right.
was Superstore must have been really interesting. Did you know Mark before? Mark McKinney, Kids in the Hall and all that. I mean, and also being from Toronto. So
Yeah.
did you know him at all, or was that kind of?
Well, what's cool is he had taught me a workshop when I was
way.
Yeah, when I was in the touring company at Second City in Toronto. So like circa 2003.
Crazy.
Yeah, he was like, I don't really remember. I was like,
Amazing.
that's fair. But like Kids in the Hall were the
Yeah.
biggest deal for me
Of course.
growing up. And he was, because I was actually the first person cast on Superstore, ironically enough. And then it was like me kind of waiting to see like who else are they going to cast in this ensemble. And then I remember seeing like a deadline announcement came out that it was like they've cast Mark McKinney, and I was like, oh, holy shit! Like, what are you talking about? Like, oh my God! Like, then it was like, oh no! Like, now I gotta we show up to play. Like, this is crazy. But I remember we shot the pilot, and there's a scene in the pilot where we're talking about crystal meth and there's like this banter between the two of us, and none of that was scripted. That was us
Really?
just on the day, and that was day 2 of shooting the pilot. And I guess we just like in the moment made this silent agreement that we were going to start improvising. And I remember we went for a really long time, like probably like 5 or 6 full minutes, and then they finally called cut. Everybody laughs, and Mark turns to me and goes, oh, Lauren, I feel like you just taught me a class on improv. And I burst into tears, and I was like, and had to walk away. Cause I was like, again, there's like a few benchmark moments for me. The Molly Shannon one was a big one. And that was a big one for me too, where I was just like, the last year of my life has been so horrible and so stressful. And I didn't know how I was going to stay afloat. And then that moment, it just, again, it felt like it was like, no, everything's going the way it's supposed to. You're going to be just fine.
Isn't that funny? It's like sometimes life is like your little canoe as you're paddling against the rapids, and then one day you just kind of pull your paddle in and just let it take you where it's going to take you, and it took you exactly where you were supposed to go, which I think is really, it's really a hell of a story that way.
Yes.
Man. So did the that must have been so crazy. I mean, when you really take a second and like, just the NBC situation comedy and the long history of Family Ties to, like all the way back to Cheers and then into Friends and The Office and Parks and Rec. It's just like, it really is the heavy hitter of all comedy, like Superstore essentially. So, is it just change your life? I mean, is it like a whole other thing now? Like, I mean, other than the fact that you are an Angelino properly now, and
Yes.
you're in the game now. I mean, like, it really must, an ensemble cast like that is so interesting too, because, it's such a, I really think it's interesting because you can kind of like, as you're watching a show, everybody's going to have their, I like this guy, I like that person, I like when these people talk, and these people have their thing. And, so it must be fun for you because every week you're dealing with a different circumstance and usually one-on-one with a different person almost every week.
Yeah.
Is that on purpose that they do that, to kind of change it up all the time, make sure that it's kind of like a different environment almost every time?
Yeah, they've always kind of, because there's certain pairings that it slips into. Obviously, there's like the Jonah and Amy storyline, obviously, for a long time. There's
Sure.
the Cheyenne and Mateo kind of friendship. There's the Dina and Garrett stuff. So they definitely do kind of keep an eye on that. And then I remember there was one season, I think it was season 4. I can't remember. It was either season 4 or season 5. And America and I were like, we haven't had anything for a while. So we literally just we marched into the writer's room. We were like, there's not enough Amy Dina stuff. Write us some more. But yeah. And they were like, oh shoot, you're right. But it is kind of like when they're also dealing in 22 episode seasons, it's crazy what the kind of writing process is.
I can't imagine.
And how it is like balancing so many plates, trying to make sure you're serving story, that you're not seeing the same pairings all the time, that you're mixing it up, that it's, there's a lot of like minutia that goes.
And even though it's episodic, there is sort of an arc going on the entire time, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So they kind of at the beginning of the season will figure that out and where they kind of want it to go. But it also can sometimes take different directions. And then, during season 6, we found out that it would be our last season. So they also had to make like a very quick left turn to go, oh shoot, we gotta wrap up this whole series in like a handful of episodes. So that was also not easy.
Yeah. I think to me, it's really disappointing I mean, any show, has its shelf life, and that's bound to happen, but I still feel like there was a lot of life left in that particular thing.
Yeah, it's interesting because they announced that, I believe it was early December of last year, 2020, and then it was January 2021 that Netflix, basically everywhere but the US, put Superstore on its platform, and it exploded. Like, again, we were number 1 in Canada for like the first month we were on there. I think we're still in the top 5. We've never left the top 5. UK, Australia, New Zealand, like Norway, Switzerland, like it has become such a huge phenomenon that it's really like, it's a very bizarre way to kind of like end the show, because as we were kind of coming to the end, and that's been very emotional for all of us, certainly for me, it's now seeing this new crazy life, which I know that a lot of NBC comedies, that's not uncommon, obviously.
Yeah.
Like, 30 Rock really came into its heyday. Parks and Rec came into its heyday kind of as it was ending. But it's been a real trip. Like, it's been really interesting to, as you're kind of winding down, to see people just finding it for the first time and being like, where has this been hiding? And I'm like, we've been here for 6 years.
Well, a lot of people don't have regular television anymore.
Yeah,
So I think that finding things in these platforms is the way people are watching television. And you're right. It's kind of like, you will probably find now you'll be more recognizable it'll have a boost again just by that platform of like, just because it's going to live on forever now in these different platforms, which is exciting. I would imagine Peacock will carry that then, right? Their own.
Yes.
There you go. There you go. Well, that's really, I mean, I don't want to, I've kept you so long. I was like,
Oh no,
and,
it's a
and
pleasure.
like I said, I could go on and on about all of these things, but, uh, yeah, well, I don't know how to end it other than just make sure you say hi to Christy for me.
I will for sure.
um,
Absolutely.
well, one of these times, I hope we could cross paths. So what is the future for you? I mean, what exactly? I know that everything's so crazy because it always ends with like, well, I don't know. No one has a crystal ball, and everybody's waiting. Like all my friends are waiting for tour dates
Yeah.
and things to open up. And for you, do you have? I mean, other than the fact that the podcasts are kicking ass, which is
Yeah.
great. You have two. Do you still have the two, or are you only kind of focusing on the one now?
No, I kind of stopped doing giving it up for less and focused on true crime and cocktails. To me, no, it was Christy came on as a guest on Giving It Up for
Right.
Less, and that was the moment that I was like, oh, this is it. Like this is the
Right.
show. And so we kind of pivoted. And yeah, it's amazing. Like even again in the past month, and I think it could also be like, Superstore is so big in the world now too that people are kind of looking for more content and stuff like that. So it has exploded in the past month for us
It's
too.
amazing. Yeah.
It's doing really, really well, which is awesome. But
and you guys were guests on that other one that I listened to the other night too. I can't remember her show, but you were guests on the one.
True Crime Daily?
Yeah, that was crazy. Yeah. There's
Yeah,
some
that
tragic
was
stories
like,
on that one. Yeah.
oh, it's so well. That one we were, because what we do again, there's a certain lightness to how we
Exactly.
attack.
That's what I
And that
like
one we were
about.
like, I was like, oh my god, the True Crime Daily. I was like, this is the big leagues. This is like real true crime. I was like, I feel like I should be wearing a blouse. Like this is. I need to get a suit jacket.
I know. Suddenly you got to deal with the grown-ups.
Totally. We were like, oh my gosh, like we feel like we felt like the 13-year-olds that have snuck in somehow to this other world. But that was a really cool experience, and she was so lovely and welcoming. It was great. But yeah, we're just gonna keep on keeping on doing that. It's so fun, and for me personally, I've also obviously been a writer as much as I've been an actor.
Yeah. I should have brought that up because you wrote on Superstore too.
Yeah, I wrote an episode in season 3, which was such a cool experience. So
cool.
That opened a lot of doors for me. So, fingers crossed, we'll see what's coming. During the pandemic, I like cranked out a couple TV pilots because, we had time. So we'll see what'll come next. We just wrapped filming the end of Superstore like a week and a half ago.
Oh, wow. Did you have to do it like, is it placed in masks and pandemic?
Yeah. There's this whole season has been in the world we're living, which I think is really cool because the show has always kind of reflected what the world is. But because of a scheduling and timing, we had to shoot the last 2 episodes in 12 days with no breaks. So it was really kind of like grinding the last.
Jeez, to make it all the more emotional, for God's sake.
Exactly. Yeah. So exhaustion set in. There was a lot of tears, but I'm sad to see it go, but I'm excited to see what's next. So
that's the exciting thing. And I'm clearly by your story alone, I'm sure it's like this is just the beginning. So I'm really excited to follow you along. And
thank you so much.
Not follow you in a true crime scary way. But that's the other part about the true crime thing is I'm just way too lazy to be a serial killer. It's just
I hear you.
I understand that extra level of like obsession. I'm just like I just couldn't be bothered. But
so much work. Feels like
the cleanup, the thing. It's like I couldn't be bothered. But I'm excited to. I'll be there for the next episode. We just listened to the Carol Baskin one, which is like I'm like I hope they cover Carol Baskin one day, and then boom, there it was. Yeah.
There you go.
And it's Princess Di. I think I haven't listened to that one.
Princess Di came out today, which we did not plan to come out with.
I know it was very timely.
It was like kismet. We didn't even realize it until Sunday. I was like, wait a minute, we've accidentally planned this perfectly. So
there was The Crown, and then this Harry and Meghan thing going on. It's like it just seems to be really, really a thing, but. Well, that's exciting. Well, I really look forward to whatever is coming next. Like I say, I hope everybody's out there watching Superstore because it's just fantastic, and you're amazing in it, and you're going to do great things. I'm excited. But
thank you so much.
One of these days we'll share a Tim Hortons and
I would love it. I would love it.
We didn't even get into all that because
I
was just saying to a friend of mine the other day, it's like if I'm sitting in a restaurant and I hear the next booth over go, "Where's your washroom?"
Yep.
I go, "Canadian." I've got all the Canadianisms. How did that work for you when you're acting in American shows? Is there ever a moment where you're sounding too Canadian?
100% has happened many times. Certainly when I first came onto the Chicago main stage, my classmates policed me all the time. I said
Really?
craft dinner and they were like, what's that? No idea. Bilingual was another word. And I was like, what am I saying? And they were like, it's bilingual. And I was like, well, come on. I'm saying it like it's written, like it's spelled.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's definitely little things here and there, 4th grade versus grade 4, like those kinds of things. But Mark and I on Superstore, we're always kind of like, I would take him aside and be like, oh, Marker, we can't say washroom. We can't, like.
I was just watching an episode of Arrested Development not that long ago. And one of my all-time favorite shows. And Michael Cera is Canadian.
Yep.
And there's a scene where he walks in. I've watched that show a million times. My kids were obsessed with it. It was a thing we would watch all the time. There's a scene where Michael Cera walks in and he goes, hey, Dad, they're out of whatever in the women's washroom. And then he walks out and I go, he said washroom on an American show. And no one thought to correct him on that. It's like, so it's restroom in America.
Yep.
It's
I always, that Michael Cera moment, I would scream. I was like, see? Yeah, I know.
You noticed that?
Out. Oh, yeah.
That's hilarious. Yeah.
Totally.
But sorry is a big one. They always point that out. Just the other day, for the first time in probably 10 years, I was hit with a Canadianism where I was talking about Yamaha, the company. Mm-hmm. They make musical instruments. They also make snowmobiles, which is what would have been my reference. But
of course.
I go, so how long were you working with Yamaha? And he goes, did you just say Yamaha? I go, yeah. He goes, oh, okay. That's a Canadian thing. It's Yamaha in America. And I go, Yamaha? Well, that doesn't even sound right. What's the vegetable? It's called a yam. It's like, yeah.
These are the things I always say. I'm like, we say words like they're spelled. I don't know what to tell you people. The one that tripped me up the other day was harbor. I kept saying harbor.
What did they say?
Harbor.
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 Interesting.
It's more of like an O almost, harbor. And I was saying harbor.
The funniest thing is living in Nevada because it's down here. It's pasta, not pasta.
Yes.
You drive a Mazda, not a Mazda. And it's Nevada, but then it's Nevada, not Nevada. So I go, it's Canadian. It's Canadian.
It's Canada South. You're so right.
If you say Nevada and Nevada, they get all kind of flustered about it.
So funny. Past is always one I argue too, because I'm like, well, P-A-S-T isn't past. So what are we talking about here?
Right.
Pasta. Just like the yam thing. It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense. But this is a separate.
Let's call the whole thing off, right?
Okay, great. Well, I look forward to catching up somewhere down the line for sure. And
absolutely.
Thank you so much for your time. Best of luck.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure, truly.
You too. Take care.
Okay, bye.